EduVerse PD podcast, brought to you by ProEd Education Solutions, your on-the-go professional development. Welcome to the world's first education podcast hosted by AI. In today's episode, our two brilliant AI co-hosts, Andy and Liz, will explore the topic of retrieval practice. They'll be breaking down key insights from the article 10 Ways to Get Retrieval Practice Wrong and How to Get It Right, written by Professor Doctor Carl Hendrick in EduVerse Newsletter, the latest issue 16. So, let's get started with Andy and Liz as they discuss how to effectively use retrieval practice in your classroom.
Hey everybody, and welcome back. Have you ever felt like you're learning something new, but it just, it doesn't stick? Like you're putting all this time, all this energy, building this incredible sandcastle of knowledge, and then whoosh, the tide of forgetting just comes in and washes it all away.
I know that feeling all too well.
Right. Well, today we're diving into a powerful technique that can really help solidify those mental sandcastles. We're talking retrieval practice. But, and this is a big but, we're not just skimming the surface here. Oh no, we're going deep. We're talking about the 10 ways you might actually be getting retrieval practice wrong.
And that's where this amazing work by Professor Carl Hendrick comes in.
And trust me, some of these pitfalls, they might surprise you.
Yeah, retrieval practice, it's a little bit like baking. It's easy enough to do, but if you don't follow that recipe carefully, you might end up with something, well, a little unexpected.
A learning disaster.
Maybe not a disaster, but at its core, retrieval practice is simple. It's just the act of trying to remember something. But it's that act of remembering, that pulling of information out of storage, it actually reshapes your memory. It makes it so much stronger and more durable over time.
Okay, that intuitively makes sense. But how does it actually work? I mean, what's going on in our brains when we're doing this retrieval practice?
Think of it like building a path through a forest.
Okay.
The more often you walk that path, the clearer, the more defined it becomes. Retrieval practice is basically like taking those mental walks through the woods. You're reinforcing those neural connections, the ones associated with that information, every time you do it.
So it's not just about what you know. It's about how often you access that knowledge, how often you use it.
So to get us started, I think the first one that he talks about really resonated with me, and I think will with a lot of people listening. This illusion of competence.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever aced a quiz right after learning something? You're like, yes, I am a rock star.
Totally.
But then a week later,
It's gone.
it's just gone.
Yeah.
Completely gone.
Totally.
And I think that's what he really hits on with this first one.
Yeah, and I think what Professor Hendrick explains there is just this idea that easy retrieval can be really, really deceptive.
Yeah.
It feels good in the moment,
Right.
but it can mean that you haven't really encoded the information deeply at all. You've kind of just skimmed the surface.
It's so true. It's like, you hear your favorite song on the radio and you're like, oh yeah, I know this one. You're singing along. You know it. You recognize it.
Yeah.
But could you sit down and write out all the lyrics?
No.
Probably not.
Probably not.
And it's like that with a lot of learning, right? It's like you think you've learned it, you recognize it,
Yeah.
but you haven't really learned it.
Right. And I think that's the distinction, isn't it? Like the effortful retrieval, like the harder you work to recall something,
Yeah.
the stronger those connections become.
If it's too easy, your brain's like, nah, I don't need to remember this.
Don't need to store this one away
It's not important.
for long-term use. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that leads nicely onto his sort of next point, which is this idea that fluency doesn't always equal understanding.
Oh, interesting.
So you might be able to, recite something, really well,
Okay.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that you really, get it.
Okay, this is me with movies or something. I can quote all the lines from The Godfather, but
Right.
ask me to explain the plot.
Yeah.
I'd be like, I don't know, something about cannoli.
Exactly. Or that mathematical formula, but you don't actually know how to apply it to solve a problem.
Yes.
And I think this is something that Professor Hendrick talks about as well, is that actually most of us probably are doing this. We've memorized the steps, but we haven't actually connected the dots.
Right. So we're kind of just going through the motions,
Yeah.
but we're not really understanding the why behind it.
Exactly. And I think it applies to, whatever walk of life you're in, whatever you're trying to learn. If it's, for students, obviously it's really important. Or if you're trying to, learn a new skill.
Yeah.
You might think, oh yeah, I've got this. But actually, have you really?
How do you know if you've really got it?
Yeah, and I think that's where Professor Hendrick talks about this idea of assessment.
Yeah.
And actually having different methods of assessment.
Okay.
It's not just about, can you just recall the information?
You're right.
Can you actually use it? Can you analyze it? Can you apply it? Can you evaluate it? And I think that's really important.
So it's more about instead of just memorizing the names of all the different parts of a cell,
Yeah.
can you explain how they work together?
Exactly.
Or the why behind it?
And I think that's where, things get really interesting.
Yeah.
And that's how we can kind of, make sure we're really learning and not just,
Going through the motions.
Yeah, exactly. Just kind of, on the surface.
Surface level stuff.
Yeah, totally.
So far we've talked about that illusion of competence, thinking we know something when we really don't. And then that fluency trap, just because you can say it doesn't mean you understand it. What's next on Professor Hendrick's list of retrieval practice pitfalls that we should watch out for?
Well, this one I thought was really interesting. He talks about how sometimes we can actually use retrieval practice primarily as a tool for assessment.
Okay.
Which can actually kind of backfire in terms of learning.
Wait, really? Because I feel like quizzes and tests, that's kind of what they are, right?
Yeah, but I think what Professor Hendrick's getting at is that the main goal or the main function of retrieval practice shouldn't just be to sort of figure out what you know.
Yeah.
It's really to help you learn better.
Oh, so it's less about figuring out what you don't know and more about really solidifying the things you do know.
Yeah, and actually I think when you're actively trying to recall that information,
right,
you're actually strengthening those connections in your brain that, know.
Oh, so when you're being quizzed on something, even if you don't realize it, that process of being quizzed is actually helping cement the information in there better?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like taking your knowledge to the gym, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like every time you retrieve a piece of information, it's like you're giving those neural pathways a workout.
Oh, I like that.
And it's making them stronger, And I think that actually helps reduce that test anxiety as well, because if you're going into a test or a quiz thinking, oh, this is a chance for me to strengthen my understanding, rather than, oh my God, I'm being judged on my intelligence, it just takes the pressure off a little bit.
Right. Because if you're less stressed, you're automatically going to perform better.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this leads on quite nicely to his next point, which is all about sort of the importance of timing.
Okay.
So just like, physical exercise, spacing out your retrieval practice is actually really important as well.
So you're saying cramming doesn't actually work?
Well, yeah. I mean,
right.
We've all been there, but it turns out that consistency is really key when it comes to retrieval practice.
Mm-hmm.
And Professor Hendrick actually highlights some really interesting research here by Bjork and Bjork. And they talk about how there's actually two types of memory strength: retrieval strength and storage strength.
Okay. Break that down for me.
Okay, so retrieval strength is basically how easily you can access that information, in that moment.
Right.
So right after you've crammed for a test,
right,
your retrieval strength might be sky high.
Yeah.
But then 5 minutes after you've actually done the test,
gone.
Exactly.
It never even happened.
Yeah. And then storage strength is how well that information has been, cemented into your long-term memory. And this is the really important part. Space retrieval practice actually strengthens both.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's more about having those shorter, more frequent review sessions.
Exactly, yeah.
Than it is about those marathon cram sessions.
Exactly. You've got it. Yeah. It's kind of like going back to the gym analogy. You need to give your brain a chance to kind of rest and recover between workouts, right?
Yeah.
And those moments of forgetting are actually beneficial.
Wait, so forgetting is a good thing now?
Well, in this context, yeah, because when you have to work a little bit harder to recall something, after a period of forgetting it, actually, it strengthens those pathways even more.
So it's your brain is oh, if they're struggling to remember this, it must be important. I'm going to store this away better.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so we're talking about testing can be a really useful tool, but I know no one likes to get things wrong.
Yeah.
What does Professor Hendrick say about that?
And I think that's a really important point. And actually, his next point is that mistakes are actually prime learning opportunities.
Okay, tell me more.
Yeah. He says we need to reframe errors as kind of like stepping stones on the path to understanding.
Okay.
And retrieval practice can actually help us sort of uncover those misconceptions early on.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So we should try to shift our thinking away from, I got that wrong, to, okay, this is a good sign. Now I know what I need to work on.
Exactly. Exactly. Think of it like, each mistake is kind of like a signpost, right? Pointing you toward the better understanding. And it's a chance to really refine your thinking and make sure you're not making the same mistake twice.
Right. Like that whole Thomas Edison thing, right? I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work.
Exactly, yeah.
And speaking of making connections, one thing that Professor Hendrick talks about that I thought was really interesting is how important it is to make sure that your retrieval practice is actually, like, tied to what you're trying to learn.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, random trivia can be fun, but
Yeah.
when it comes to actually learning something effectively, it seems like you really need to be laser focused on the actual concept that you're trying to learn.
And I think this comes back to this idea of building a solid, framework of understanding, not just like a random assortment of facts.
Right. Yeah. So it's less about just memorizing a bunch of disconnected facts, and it's more about like seeing how those facts all fit together.
Yeah, like, you're building a house, right? You wouldn't just like start nailing boards together randomly.
Yeah.
You'd want a blueprint to make sure everything, fits together structurally.
Totally.
And I think, your curriculum or your learning objectives, whatever, that's like the blueprint, right? And retrieval practice is just a tool that can really help you build that solid foundation.
I like that. That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we want to be strategic about what we're retrieving, but what about when we're actually first learning something? Like Professor Hendrick talks about pre-testing as like a potential pitfall there.
Yeah, and I think, what he's really cautioning against there is going too crazy with the pre-testing, especially when it's something you're just starting to learn about.
Right.
Because you kind of need at least a little bit of existing knowledge to work with, right?
Because if you literally know nothing about it,
yeah,
and you're just being asked questions about it, it's like you're just guessing randomly.
Right, and you might get lucky, you might guess a few, right?
Yeah.
But it's not going to actually lead to any real learning. And I think this is where it gets interesting, because Professor Hendrick actually talks about how retrieval practice can actually make those misconceptions even stronger.
Oh, wow. Okay, so if you try to remember something and you get it wrong, like you're kind of solidifying that wrong answer in your brain?
Potentially, yeah. Yeah, which is why I think, combining retrieval practice with feedback is really, really important. So it's like you're going back to the house analogy, right?
Yeah.
You've accidentally used a few like wobbly bricks
right.
in your foundation. And retrieval practice is like shining a spotlight on those weak spots.
I see.
But you need the feedback to be like, okay, actually, let's swap these out with some, sturdy ones.
Right. So it's like retrieval practice is like a diagnostic tool.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
But then you need to like take the next step.
Exactly.
And actually correct those mistakes.
Totally.
Which kind of leads to his next point, which is that he really encourages us to go beyond just recognition.
Yeah.
When it comes to retrieval practice, like obviously multiple choice questions have their place.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not really making you like fully recall the information.
Totally. Yeah.
So it's almost like we have to force ourselves to like remember it without needing those multiple choice options.
Yeah. And I always think of it like that, the difference between recognizing a familiar face in a crowd and actually remembering their name and how you know them.
Yes.
It's like recognition is fine, but actually if you really want to, master something, you need to be able to recall it.
So how do we actually get better at that? Like, are there strategies that we can use to like train our brains to be better at recalling information?
Yeah, and I think Professor Hendrick has some really great tips here as well. And he talks about how, retrieval is a skill.
Okay.
And like any skill, it can be improved with, practice and the right technique.
Right.
So he suggests incorporating things like elaboration. So that's where you're actually like, explaining a concept in your own words.
Yeah.
He also talks about concept mapping. So creating like visual diagrams to see how different ideas connect.
Yeah. So it's more about like actively working with the information rather than just trying to like cram it in there.
Exactly.
And then his very last point, which I think is so important, is he really emphasizes keeping retrieval practice low stakes.
Yeah.
Because I feel like nothing makes you want to learn less than feeling like if you get it wrong, you're going to be judged or,
Yeah.
It's like the worst.
No one wants to feel like that.
So what are some ways to kind of keep it more low key?
Well, I think, he talks about incorporating those, like, frequent low-pressure retrieval practice activities. So it could be like quick quizzes, flashcards, even just, summarizing what you've learned to a friend.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Just making it a regular habit, I think, is the key.
This has been so interesting. Thank you. So basically, retrieval practice, super powerful tool for learning. But like with any tool, you got to know how to use it properly.
You do.
And thankfully, Professor Hendrick has given us like a really clear roadmap for how to actually avoid those pitfalls and actually get the most out of this technique.
And on that note, we will leave you with this final thought. What's one small change that you can make this week to start incorporating more effective retrieval practice into your own learning? Until next time, happy learning, everyone.
Thank you, Andy and Liz, for those practical strategies on using retrieval practice in the classroom. If you want to dive deeper into the full article, head over to our website and download EduVerse Newsletter, Issue 16. It's filled with insightful articles, including Professor Dr. Carl Hendrick's full piece on retrieval practice. Just visit www.proed.com.vn/eduverse. And don't forget, EduVerse is always looking for new voices. If you have expertise, ideas, or best practices to share, we'd love for you to submit your article. Your insights could reach a global audience and help drive meaningful change in education. Well, we hope you enjoy our episode today, and we can't wait to welcome you again in our next episode on EduVerse PD Podcast, brought to you by ProEd Education Solutions.